Hi, everyone. This is Ken Feudernick, the host of Courageous Conversations about our schools, welcoming you back to the third and final episode of our series about a school district in Middletown, Ohio. In the first episode, we heard about a culture war that was brewing around mask mandates and public comments about the district's commitment to diversity and inclusion that were made by a Black superintendent at the time. In the second episode, we learned how what could have been a protracted and debilitating culture war was averted, not by sheer force, with one side defeating the other, but through listening and dialogue, and by calling on parents and community leaders to engage in a conversation about the district's policies, practices, and its values. In this final episode, several people from Middletown and some from outside who have listened to the story reflect on the lessons it teaches. We begin with Courtney Martin, the author of the article that appeared in the Christian Science Monitor that first described this story back in June of 2023. It was titled "Stopping Culture Wars in Their Tracks: How One City Did It."
Well, I'm deeply pragmatic as a parent of two public school kids, as someone who has sat in a million school board meetings, as someone who sat on the school site council at my kids' Title I school. I feel like we have no time to waste. There are so many kids who are not learning to read on grade level, who are not learning to do their math, who don't feel like they belong, who are dealing with all kinds of really challenging things at home that come into the classroom that our incredible teachers are like triaging every day. So for me, the beauty of the story is the dilution of the distraction, is that Marlon Stiles, the superintendent, and this community was able to say, no, we are focusing on kids. We are focusing on what matters. For me, that's the huge win here. I think one of the crises of our time is our inability to stay focused and keep the main thing, including in the educational context, but in so many contexts. I mean, you think about climate change, you think about our criminal justice system. There are so many settings in which we quite easily let politics lead us to focus on these particular, very flashy characters in our political landscape, or these particular issues that a bunch of really smart people figured out would distract us, instead of keeping the main thing. And so that's why I think this story is at least a temporary success. And we have questions about long-term success, but I'm just really interested in anything that helps people stay focused on what really matters. And I think that this approach with the Ministerial Alliance, with Marlon Stiles, and with the Positive Gospers really did that.
Courtney, there are people that will be listening to this that are perhaps parents, they're teachers, they're educators, concerned people in communities across America, including perhaps even your own town of Oakland, thinking, is there any possibility of us doing here what they did in Middletown? What might people do if they wanted to try to get something started like they did in Middletown?
I would understand anyone's cynicism about revitalizing civic culture. I think it is daunting, but I really don't think we have a choice. I look at my kids and I don't have a choice. I want them to live in a country that actually reflects their values and reflects a sense that there is like wide public participation, and we look out for each other, and we have these public institutions that help people who weren't as lucky as my kids were to be born into an economically secure family make their way and learn and create lives of meaning. So I don't think we really have a choice.
One of the things that I've been talking with people about is this idea of doing something that would allow people in the community to come together and have civil conversations in small groups where they could really listen to one another. Initially, just, what are we most appreciative of in our district? What are the things that might make it better? What can we do to overcome the challenges that might get in the way? And at least get people in the room where people that might not want to come and speak in a mic at a school board meeting where there isn't really any dialogue would say, yeah, I'll come to that. And it sounds inviting. They're going to have food and they've promised to ensure that it's not going to be contentious. I'm wondering if you think something like that would potentially be the kind of thing, if it were organized by some group, maybe the Ministerial Alliance, city council, other concerned civic groups, that could be the thing that sustains the positive changes that you wrote about in Middletown.
One of the things I was really interested in, and I still might pursue more reporting around, is, do school board meetings need to be structured in such a way that, basically works against any kind of authentic dialogue between school board members and community members? Maybe the answer lies in not looking for school board meetings to be any different and just creating alternative spaces where people can actually be heard. But I'm also still invested in the idea that school board meetings themselves don't have to be so terrible either. By the way, my editor, Trudy, who's wonderful, I do think she would be wonderful to talk to, because that's one of the stories of this too, is that the actual people who made the journalism, white woman in her 40s and a Black woman in her, I think, 60s, who's like a veteran journalist and editor who lives in St. Louis. So at every level, this story has been about interracial collaboration and people really listening to each other and making each other better.
I'm Trudy Palmer. I live in St. Louis, and I am now the cover story editor at the Christian Science Monitor, which is based in Boston. Obviously, I'm working remotely. And that's how I came to get to work with Courtney. It was a very natural story for the Monitor because we care about solutions, we care about getting beneath the conflict to the good that is going on. And we care very much about showing people how that good operates and making sure that the story is, while very specific, obviously, this story was to Middletown. I loved the way that Courtney at many moments would expand in a way so that we could say, oh, I can relate to that, or, oh, I know someone like that, or so that it is, maybe we don't have kids, have never had kids, maybe we don't care that much about education, but there's a lot in that story for just how we live our lives. That's not at all to say that what it's saying about education and culture wars is minimized or less important or anything like that. It's just that it's two sides of a coin. This very specific example in education has quite universal application beyond education, I think.
What are some of those takeaways for you? What are some of those lessons that go beyond just trying to stave off culture wars? What are the takeaways for you?
I so admired the protagonist, Marlon Stiles, in his enthusiasm, his willingness to take instruction and then turn that into something so much more. I think a lot more listening in the world would help us. So that was, to me, a very important takeaway and a very important example that he provided. He also recognized that clearly he needed to find an answer, but that answer didn't have to come from him. He realized, okay, I'm not necessarily the one to solve this. So that's when he goes to the Ministerial Alliance. And he realizes there are people in this community who have devoted their career, their lives, to creating a sense of community, creating unity. Why would I not ask their help? And so the humility was another important takeaway for me, that, I mean, he could so easily, and maybe he did, feel personally attacked, but his focus on the kids, doing what was needed to keep the kids front and center, and his humility and his willingness to ask for help. I think that's something not all of us do well. And he essentially called in experts on unity and on community and on being humane. One of the other interesting things is that their participation in the open comment section, it's not just that they keep talking, but they're adding to the conversation or kind of wresting away the conversation from those who are intent upon antagonism. It brings out the voice of a lot of members of the silent majority, because that's the thing, the squeaky wheel. You can easily start to think, oh, all we have are squeaky wheels who, are pointing out everything they think is wrong, not really offering solutions, not really willing to listen, not really willing to work with people. And the silent majority gets kind of more quiet, more silent, sort of understandably. But this ministerial alliance, their focus on the kids, their focus on, hey, we know how to be a community. We know that is important to us. Let's not forget this. They weren't telling anybody what was right or what was wrong. They weren't taking positions on things. They were just saying, don't lose sight of the kids, number one, and of what Middletown as a community means. And as they put that into the mix, then other people started to feel like, oh, it's safe for me to say something.
Tell me if there is truth to this narrative about journalists being drawn to stories of outrage and of culture wars and dysfunction, and perhaps being less inclined to tell a story about like Middletown, where the culture wars were averted, at least temporarily. Is there truth to that?
I think it's a little bit of a vicious cycle. Who knows how it started, but I think for many outlets, there's a sense that bad news is what attracts readers, and that's what they want to do. And so, they're satisfying the reader. So it just kind of becomes a reinforcing thing. But, we have all of these news avoiders because it's certainly not all, and maybe not even actually what people want to read, what an awful lot of people want to read. I'm not just talking about an isolated happy story. That's nice, but really, I think what people want is a sense of some hope and the getting beneath. Of course, you got to be honest about all the bad stuff that's happening. I'm not saying that you ignore it or anything like that, but there is more than that going on. That's not all that's going on. And so let's also talk about the good that's going on, the efforts to improve the situation, even the desire to improve the situation. Let's just talk about more than what we think will be a headline grabber. Our editor likes to refer to Alan Paton. He wrote Cry the Beloved Country. Apparently, he was a big Monitor reader and said that what he liked about it was that it offered credible hope. Not
pie in the sky.
Cheery, all that, but credible hope.
I like that.
Amanda Ripley actually recommended Courtney to us, and hard to get a higher recommendation than that.
My name is Amanda Ripley, and I'm a journalist and the author of a book called High Conflict, and I also co-founded a company called Good Conflict. I love the story because we desperately need examples of how people and communities manage to get out of dysfunctional conflict, not just in, right? And there are lots and lots of examples, but we hear very few stories about it. The only way to learn, right, is by finding these outliers or positive deviants, right? Like communities that manage to not implode in conflict just yet, and learn from what they did. So I love this story, and I'm very grateful to you and to Courtney and to everybody who participated in it, because we desperately need to sort of show, not tell, about how we as humans can function in the age of conflict that we're in.
So let's talk about Marlon Stiles a bit, because he's such a central figure in the story that Courtney wrote about. And in this podcast, he does something somewhat unexpected. He's the target of some pretty strong criticism, being racist, I suppose, and having some sort of other agenda. And yet he decides not to, as he said, become the target. And he said, I realized I just needed to shut up and listen. And I just wonder if you could talk about that first, and then I'll ask you about the other surprising sort of counterintuitive move, which was to reach out to all these people that he had formed relationships with, the Ministerial Alliance, this quiet majority, and all these people start showing up subsequent meetings and voicing their support for him and what the board was doing. But just talk a little bit about his response, which was to listen rather than to engage.
I think there's a lot to be learned from the way that Marlon Stiles realized very quickly what it sometimes takes people years or decades to realize in high conflict. It seems like he realized very quickly that his intuition was not going to be helpful to him in this kind of conflict. In the age we're living in, our intuition usually will make the conflict worse. So defending yourself, attacking your critics, that kind of stuff just doesn't work and often can sort of supersize your opponents. And it seems like he figured this out really fast and realized that he had to do a bunch of listening, which is counterintuitive in these moments where you're being attacked unfairly in some cases, right? That you have to actually get curious about that. Very uncomfortable. Not my first instinct, right? And also to not do it alone. You know, he said something very important. He said, how we are going to respond to this problem, not me. There is an instinct among the superintendents and other leaders that I have worked with to really wall up in this kind of conflict, to kind of man up, never let them see you sweat, don't reveal your vulnerabilities. And that unfortunately does not work in this kind of conflict, if it ever works. So here again, the counterintuitive thing is to ask for help, to call on people you have relationships with, to build new relationships, maybe most importantly. And it sounds like that's what he did. That is really hard work. It's uncomfortable. It's risky. But that's the only thing that I have seen work in all kinds of contexts, from interrupting gang violence to civil war to, politics in the United States.
For people listening to say, we haven't had any rumblings of a culture war, and I really don't want it to happen, but what can I be doing now to ensure that if people came in and started conflict entrepreneurs or people just fearful that something bad is happening here, that we could respond well to it and it wouldn't develop into a full-blown culture war?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question, because this is the best moment and the best opportunity to really lay the groundwork for good, healthy conflict, right? When you're not on the verge of, a total fiasco, that this is the moment. I would urge anyone in any position of civic engagement or leadership to be actively working on the only known antidote to the culture wars, which is good, healthy conflict, a culture that surfaces conflict in a way that is useful and generative. You have to create that culture in advance. And that's the only way, really, to inoculate yourself. I want to give an example here. I was recently talking to Katie Anthus, who is the former commissioner at the Colorado Department of Education. And Katie was saying that she lasted for 7 years, which in this climate is like 70. I mean, it's a very long time. So I asked her, how did you do this? And she said, if you're a new superintendent coming into a new space, you've got to build human connection with the people you disagree with. And this is where, she said, none of us want to lean into conflict as superintendents, but for her, that was the only thing that helped her survive for 7 years, is what she said. She said, small interactions are like inoculations against high conflict. And we know that from the research even on marriage, which is, you need about a 5-to-1 ratio is what John and Julie Gottman found in the marriage lab in Seattle. 5-to-1 ratio of, quick positive interactions for every negative. And the same is true in a school district. So you really have to create recurring, routine moments of connection, interaction, joy, celebration that are authentic, right? That are not just made up. And you have to do that on purpose before you need it.
And Marlon did do that. He went out and created this group well before the beginnings of a fiasco started. He had these positive gossipers. And one of the things he did to gain their trust was he said he was very transparent and honest about revealing some of the challenges in the district. Not everything is going well here.
Mhm.
And he told them that. And that seemed, I remember in Courtney's story, seemed to be something that didn't, that brought people in closer to him, that he was willing to share the good, the bad, the ugly with the community. And then later, when he needed their support, which he got, it didn't just come out of the blue. It's like, oh, you have a crisis, and I don't even know who you are. But he had already done what you suggested, which is to develop these relationships with people well before the crisis almost erupted.
It's funny because my first book was about human behavior in mass casualty disasters. Why do different disasters go so differently, even in neighboring towns? And one of the most consistent findings in the research is that the health of those relationships and that community before the disaster matters more than the actual disaster. So, you can have a very similar earthquake or terrorist attack or hurricane in two given communities. And of course, many things matter. But one of the things that matters the most, and yet is rarely discussed, is the health of that community, the health of those relationships in advance. Because to your point, as Marlon Stiles seemed to understand, you have to cultivate those relationships in a genuine way, which means warts and all, right? And I often, when I'm covering a story, have to kind of find, I really won't do a story about a place where the people I'm interviewing will only tell me positive things, because that's not real, and I think we need to build enough trust, though, so that people will share warts and all, right? And the best stories I've done, even when they're incredibly positive, include things that didn't work, things that where we fell short as a community or an organization. And I think the same is true as a leader, is you have to be willing to be a little bit vulnerable all the time, especially in an age of conflict. Every high conflict I've ever seen is usually about one of four things. And this I sometimes call the understory of the conflict, right? The thing it's really about. Usually it's about power and control, respect and recognition, care and concern, or stress and overwhelm, right? But we almost never talk about those things. So we get very caught up, and this is true in marriages as much as it is in politics. We get very caught up in the facts, who said what, who's right, who's wrong. And that's all important, but that's like what you see above the waterline. And underneath is the iceberg, which is the understory. So my curiosity from this story so far has been piqued because I want to know, what is the understory for these folks who were so upset about this diversity video and masking, whatever combination of things it was. The diversity video and the masking are important, and they are the things above the waterline, right? They are the facts, the he said, she said. Those are the things we get really tied up around. But underneath, there's more going on. And usually it's about fear and overwhelm in this case, but also respect and recognition and power and control. But I don't know. And it's different things for different people. And the only way I know of to get to the understory, which is the most interesting, useful part of the conflict, is to ask different questions and listen really carefully and check if I'm getting it right. So as a journalist, this is what I now try to do when I'm covering conflict, is try to glimpse what the understory is, because that's the thing I most need to know. I can have endless fights above the waterline. I mean, we see this, right? That it's, One day it's masks, the next day it's books, the next day it's Israel and Palestine. Those are all important things. But we will never, ever get to a more constructive kind of conflict culture unless we start looking below the waterline.
Something I love that you've written or spoken about, and maybe you could just say a little bit about this, is that if you want other people to change, or at least be open to the possibility of change, we have to make ourselves hearable. So what is it that makes us hearable?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of our time is that we don't even know the words to use to make ourselves hearable to the other side, because we don't have enough relationships across these divides. We aren't dating or marrying or befriending people who are different than us politically. So I might say a word or reference a set of ideas that mean one thing to you and something very different to me. And I don't even know. This happens all the time. So I'll, often ask someone who's very different than me politically or racially or age-wise to read stuff I'm writing, because there's things they're seeing in there that I just don't see, And sometimes we're going to agree to disagree, and I'm going to leave it just like it was. And other times, oh man, I can just change 3 words and it'll be hearable. But it gets harder and harder, right? The more separate we are and the more afraid we are of each other. So, we have really decided that we are the enemy, and we have been manipulated by a lot of folks on TV news, in print journalism as well, but also in Congress and other places. And, we're having a lot of the wrong fights with the wrong people, which means we're not having the fights we really need to have. Because we need to have some fights in this country, and we need to have them in a way that we can understand each other, even if we never agree. Otherwise, we're going to just keep having nonsense fights forever, which, eventually, who suffers? I mean, you see it here in this story. Who suffers in high conflict? Whether it's a high conflict divorce or high conflict politics, it's always the kids. Kids suffer more than anyone else. And so we have got to be braver and more creative and more humble about these conflicts and not assume that we know, because we don't.
I love our public schools. I have, not really had many problems at all with them. We've been fortunate. We live in a really great elementary area, and all of the staff at Wildwood has felt like family. Middletown has always just kind of felt like home to me. My name is Holly Snow, and I have lived in Middletown 13 years this time around, and lived here previously in my childhood, and I am doing my first year on Middletown City School Board.
Do you get a sense, just the few months you've been on the board, that it's unlikely that some culture war will erupt where you're back at a place where, angry people are coming to school board meetings and accusing the board and the superintendent of doing things they shouldn't? Or do you think there's a calmer environment where people can raise concerns, legitimate concerns, and have civil conversations with the board and between board members?
We, as a board, we are very open. We always want to listen to everyone. I really do feel like we do listen. Like we have always welcomed people to come in and chat with us. Like I want to know what people have issues with, because how am I supposed to fix it if I don't know what you have problems with? Joining the board, I've learned a lot. As a parent, I thought that, the board had way more say in a lot of things and what went on than what we actually do. We have a lot of keyboard warriors as parents who have a big opinion on Facebook, but they don't back their opinions with any type of action or showing up at board meetings. And I'm like, for me, that was one of the reasons why I joined the board was, hey, I want to be heard. I want to have an opinion in things. I have kids in the school. My husband works at a brake manufacturing company. So, we don't own our home. We rent. We are very much that lower, working class. So I can understand the struggles that a lot of our parents deal with here. And I can understand a lot of that. And that was something I wanted to bring to the board, was having that perspective. I don't ever want people to feel like the school board is just hiding things from them, because that's never something that we strive to do. I always tell people, if you've got something, a concern, like, come to us, tell us what's going on and what your issues are. And we want to work through everything that we're going through. Unfortunately, a lot of times you just do see a lot of the loudest people are the ones that are the loudest on social media. And they don't want to actually bring it to you. And even though we're like, hey, we're humans too, man, like, come talk to us. Like, I shop at Walmart too. Please don't ever be afraid to come and express that to us, because we want to know. We can't fix an issue just by seeing one side of something on Facebook. Middletown has a lot of work to do, and we have our hands full, but I really do think that we are heading in the right direction, and we're taking a lot of steps to do what needs to be done. And I really feel like it's just going to get better year after year.
The vast majority of conversations that take place in Middletown are peaceful, respectful, but there are disagreements.
Here is Dr. Mark Frazier, a retired physician and a longtime former school board member in Middletown.
People are invested, and I always felt that if someone's invested and wants to spend time talking to me about the issues, about policy, and not take me on personally, I'm more than happy as an individual and as a board member to sit down and chat. The first thing you have to do when you're in conflict with someone is understand where they're coming from and why they're coming from that direction. And if you can do that, then you've got half a chance that they will provide you the same courtesy to explain why you believe what you believe. There's a strategy, there's a way of introducing a topic that will get you the results, or at least allow you to be heard most effectively. But that conversation needs to happen before there's a crisis, before the temperature in the room rises so high that you cannot take that pause to say, okay, I need to understand their perspective. I think there's always culture wars. It's just the topic changes. I've always felt that schools are something that people can have a very invested interest in, because as parents, you want those parents to say, I want the best for my child. And if they become engaged in the community, if they're given an opportunity to become engaged and heard in the schools, then they're much more likely to be an advocate and at least have an understanding that while you're focused on one child, we're focused on the 6,000 other students.
I want to say something about pastors serving in communities like this one.
Here again, John Wagner, a member of the Ministerial Alliance, whom we heard from in the last episode.
There are all kinds of pastors, all kinds of churches, evangelical, mainline, black, white, Hispanic, some larger, some smaller, mega churches with a lot of, loud rock and roll music, others with more traditional worship. All of us pastors are involved in the community in one way or another, through our church members, or else, through an association like the Ministerial Alliance. And I think we've all had to learn how to talk to people. We all want to contribute positively. I think that what Superintendent Stiles did was just exactly right. Ask pastors to do what they do best, and that is to come in and say something to a community, remind them of their values, try to remind them of our common humanity, and to kind of tone down the rhetoric. That's one of the things we've all had to learn how to do. as pastors. So I would say to other people throughout the country and to school superintendents or anybody wanting to keep things on a more reasonable or keep dialogue open, do contact pastors in your community. I believe that we are often an untapped resource.
All of these culture wars often are about views with regard to religion. And so any superintendent going forward that tries to get at this without sitting down and talking about who are the religious leaders in our community makes, in my judgment, a big mistake.
Here is Dr. Carl Cohn. He is professor emeritus at Claremont Graduate School in California and former superintendent of the state's second and third largest school districts. He's also engaged with a Harvard researcher in a study about the rise of school culture wars and what can be done to avoid them.
I think the cultural wars are, in fact, the result of the prolonged pandemic. I also think the good news is that people actually care about K-12 youngsters. But I do think a really important thing is post-pandemic, what are those re-engagement strategies? And I think that's a critical issue that superintendents, school board members need to face going forward. What are those post-pandemic engagement strategies where you're really starting over to engage support from the public? It's part of the reason why Middletown, Ohio presents this fascinating development. All of us who are educators want to believe that those skills that we have in terms of finding common ground, anyone who's ever taught a tough classroom of kids knows that listening and finding out where people are, meeting folks where they are, and coming up with solutions that make sense is what any successful educator does. The Middletown, Ohio story is incredibly important because it establishes that a hardworking, focused superintendent who really cares about the entire community that they're working in can make a difference during these extraordinary times that we're all working in. And I think the temptation always, when you get hit with criticism, is to defend yourself. And I love what Superintendent Stiles did. Rather than the traditional, oh my gosh, how am I going to defend the district and myself? He said, I got to listen. I absolutely have to figure out how to listen. His outreach to the community. How do I bring people inside? How do I get them to tell the story rather than the classic, as the leader of this system, here is the prepared defense of the system. But listening is really the key to what makes the Middletown story so important and such a valuable object lesson for the rest of the country.
Well, this concludes our series about Middletown. I hope you enjoyed listening to it, and if you think others, particularly school leaders, parents, and school board members, would find it interesting and useful, I hope you will share it with them and that you will post it on your social media sites. People can, of course, find this 3-part series and all of our episodes of Courageous Conversations about our schools at schoolconversations.org and on their favorite podcasting platforms. Before signing off, I want to express my deep gratitude to everyone who participated in this story, particularly the kind and thoughtful people from Middletown that I interviewed, and in some cases have gotten to know: school administrators, board members, parents, the positive gossipers, and members of the Ministerial Alliance. Your story that offers not just hope, but credible hope, as Trudy Palmer calls it, is an inspiring gift to everyone across the country who is determined to keep the main thing the main thing.